Diego Montoya was not a monster, but the world was determined to make him one. Before we dive into this abyss, I want to ask something of you, who accompany us on every story. If this account in some way touches something deep inside you, please help us continue. Our goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers so that voices like Diego's, even in fiction, are not lost in the silence. Comment and let us know where you're watching from, as every city and every country that connects with us gives us the strength to carry on. Diego was, in his essence, a beacon of hope. At 23 years old, he was the most brilliant student in his law school class, a young man consumed by the almost childlike belief that justice, the kind written in books and defended in courtrooms, was the most powerful force in the universe. He saw the law not as a set of rules, but as a shield for the innocent. Raised in a middle-class home in Mexico City, Diego absorbed the values of honesty and ethics from his parents. His house had no luxuries, but it was rich in principles. His father, an accountant, and his mother, a teacher, taught him that a man's dignity was measured by his word and by his courage to defend what is right. He grew up watching the news with a mixture of sadness and determination, promising himself that he would become a relentless prosecutor, someone who would put the corrupt and the violent behind bars. For him, justice was not a profession, but a calling, an almost divine summons to restore order in a country that bled daily from its absence. His moral compass, his true north, had a name, Sophia. His younger sister, just 16 years old, was the personification of the innocence he had sworn to protect. It was for her, and because of her, that he studied to the point of exhaustion. He saw in her eyes the future he desired for Mexico, a future where a girl could walk the streets without fear. Their relationship was one of deep complicity. He was her protector, her confidant, the hero of her stories. Every academic achievement of Diego's was celebrated as a victory for them both, one more step toward a safer world for her. This silent promise, made in the recess of his heart, was the fuel that fed his idealistic soul. Mexico City was a stage of brutal contrasts, and Diego moved between its two acts daily. On one side, the bright classrooms and imposing corridors of the university, where the law was debated with intellectual fervor and the nation's futures were shaped. On the other, the peripheral neighborhoods, the favelas that clung to the hills like open wounds, where the only law was that of the strongest, dictated by the Los Espectros cartel. Diego believed, with the arrogance of youth, that the university walls could contain the darkness outside, that the knowledge he was acquiring would be the ultimate weapon to purify the streets and return peace to those who lived under the yoke of fear. This conviction was often tested in debates with his mentor, Professor Elena Vargas. She saw a rare brilliance in Diego, a passion for justice that reminded her of herself in her youth. However, she also saw a dangerous naivete. The law is made of paper, Diego. The world out there is made of steel and blood, she once warned him after an impassioned speech of his on the supremacy of the rule of law. Elena tried to prepare him for the reality of a judicial system eroded by corruption, where justice was often auctioned off to the highest bidder. Diego, however, listened respectfully, but refused to accept it. To him, giving up on the perfection of the law was the first step toward surrender. The shadow of the Los Espectros cartel was a constant presence, a background noise in everyone's life. Its tentacles stretched throughout the city, from the poorest alleys to the most luxurious offices of power. The nightly news was a daily obituary of its victims. At home, Diego's parents watched with apprehension, locking the doors earlier, making the sign of the cross whenever a new atrocity was reported. Diego, for his part, felt a growing fury. He saw each victim as a personal failure, an urgent reminder of his mission. He did not understand fear as a warning, but as an offense, a direct challenge to the order he was preparing to defend with tooth and nail. Tragedy did not ask for permission to enter. It began as a small deviation from the routine, a subtle disquiet. Sophia was late coming home from a friend's house. The first hour of delay was filled with excuses, the second with unanswered calls that went to voicemail. The third hour brought panic, a bitter bile rising in the throats of the Montoya family. Calls to the police were met with cold bureaucracy, a carelessness that hurt more than any insult. The night dragged on in a heavy silence, broken only by his mother's stifled sobs. Diego's idealism began to crack, exposed for the first time to the cruel indifference of the system he so idolized. Diego Montoya's world ended on a Tuesday morning, in a cold, anonymous room in a morgue. The confirmation came in the form of a white sheet that, when pulled back, revealed Sophia's face, marked by a violence his mind refused to process. In that instant, the silence of the place became deafening. There were no screams, no immediate tears. There was only the implosion of a universe. All the laws, all the books, all the dreams of justice turned to ash. The idealistic prosecutor died there, next to his sister's body. In his place, something new and terrifyingly focused began to awaken, an entity forged by the purest pain and fueled by a single, overwhelming purpose: revenge. Sophia's funeral was an event suffocated by fear. The Montoya family's grief was an island in an ocean of terrified silence. Neighbors and friends attended, their faces masks of condolence, but their eyes revealed panic. They gave fleeting hugs and whispered words of comfort, always looking over their shoulders as if the very mention of the Los Espectros cartel could mark their doors. The priest, in his sermon, spoke of angels and heaven, but his words found no echo in the dense, oppressive atmosphere of the chapel. Diego stood motionless, a spectre among the living. He did not hear the hymns or the prayers. He heard the deafening sound of impunity, the laughter of the murderers who, he knew, were breathing the same air as he at that very moment. Diego's first death was not that of a criminal, but that of his faith. It happened in a musty room at the police station, which stank of stale coffee and empty promises. Before him and his father stood Detective Javier Ramirez, a man with the weariness of the world etched on his face. He leafed through Sophia's case file with the indifference of someone reading a grocery list. His words were a slow poison. These cases are complicated. Lack of witnesses. The cartel is dangerous, you understand. To the system, Sophia was just another number, an inconvenient statistic. Diego, his voice cracking, tried to argue, citing procedures and rights. The detective just looked at him with condescending pity, a look that said, "Kid, your books are worthless here." The weeks that followed were a bureaucratic torture. Sophia's case was officially closed for lack of evidence. Diego, using his law student's acumen, tried to reopen it, filing petitions and looking for legal loopholes. But every door he tried to open was slammed shut with the rust of corruption and apathy. He began his own investigation, clandestine and dangerous. On the streets, the names of the murderers were an open secret, whispered in dark corners. El Chacal and El Gusano, two low-level sicarios from the cartel. Everyone knew. The police knew. And no one did anything. The truth was an open, festering wound, and the system, the great healer he had believed in, just threw dirt over it to pretend it didn't exist. The breaking point, the moment the thread that still tied Diego to sanity snapped, happened on a Saturday night. Walking past a noisy cantina, he saw them. El Chacal and El Gusano were sitting at a table, drinking beer and laughing. Their laughter was like ground glass in Diego's ears. They were living, breathing, feeling pleasure, while his sister lay under 6 feet of cold earth. At one point, El Chacal noticed him from across the street. Their eyes met. The sicario showed no fear or remorse. He raised his bottle in a silent, mocking toast, a rotten smile spreading across his face. It was a declaration of power, a spit in the face of Diego and in the memory of Sophia. Impunity had a face, and he would never forget it. That night, Diego Montoya returned home. But the young man who walked through the door was not the same one who had left. He went up to his room, a sanctuary of laws and codes, and looked at his library. The books that once represented hope now looked like tombstones of a dead faith. With a slow, deliberate gesture, he took the heavy volume of criminal law and closed it. The sound echoed in the quiet room like a sentence being handed down. The law was dead, and in that vacuum he made a new vow, not to the Constitution or the state, but to his sister's blood. If justice would not come to them, he would hunt it down. He would be the judge, the jury, and the executioner. It is at this moment we ask ourselves, what would we do in his place? If the pain and anger of this young man reach you, subscribe. Your subscription is a reminder that every victim deserves a voice, and the journey that begins now must be witnessed. Diego's revenge began not with an explosion, but with cold, methodical planning. The law student applied his academic discipline to the art of the hunt. He sold his laptop, his watch, and some rare books, turning the last vestiges of his old life into dirty money on the black market. With it, he bought a worn, unregistered 9mm pistol from a man whose eyes he made a point not to meet. For 2 weeks, he did nothing but watch. Hiding in the shadows, he mapped every step of his first prey, El Gusano. He noted his schedules, his vices, his routes. Fear was an electric current under his skin, but his anger was the insulator. He wasn't acting on impulse. He was drafting the first clause of a new penal code, one written in blood. He chose as his courtroom a narrow, foul-smelling alley, one of the many tiers in the urban fabric where the law never ventured. The night was his accomplice, swallowing light and sound. Crouched behind a dumpster, Diego felt his heart hammer against his ribs, a war drum announcing the verdict. The smell of garbage and urine filled his lungs, the perfect atmosphere for what was to come. Every moving shadow, every distant noise, stretched his nerves to their limit. He was not a killer, he was a boy who read Plato and dreamed of a just world. But that boy was dying with every second that passed in that alley, giving way to something more primitive and determined. When El Gusano finally stumbled into the alley, drunk, time seemed to slow down. Diego emerged from the shadows, the gun trembling in his hand. The sicario, upon seeing him, let out an arrogant laugh, thinking it was a robbery. But then Diego spoke, and the only word he said was his sister's name, Sophia. The arrogance on the criminal's face dissolved, replaced by a flash of recognition, and, finally, dread. In that instant, the power shifted. The hunter and the prey reversed their roles under the faint light of a distant street lamp. Diego was no longer the helpless victim. He was the consequence, the debt that had come to be collected in full. The first murder was a clumsy, brutal act. It had none of the elegance of cinema, nor the precision of a professional. It was the ugly collision of rage and inexperience. The first shot hit El Gusano in the shoulder, who screamed in pain and surprise. The second, fired in a panic, missed its target. Diego moved closer, the man's face now a mask of terrified pleading. Looking into his eyes, Diego saw not a monster, but a pathetic worm. He pulled the trigger one last time. The sound of the shot was a thunderclap in the alley's silence, and the recoil of the gun nearly tore it from his hand. The silence that followed was even more violent. He turned and vomited, his body rebelling against the transgression his soul had committed. Fleeing through the dark streets, Diego did not feel the triumph he had imagined. There was an icy void where satisfaction should have been. His hands were stained, not just with blood, but with an irrevocable choice. The line had been crossed. He had killed a man. That act separated him forever from the rest of humanity, from the world of laws and morality he had once defended. The pain of losing Sophia was still there, but now it was accompanied by a new kind of agony, the awareness of his own monstrosity. Yet amidst the revulsion, there was also an ember of resolve. One was down, one to go. The journey, he understood, was just beginning. The second target, El Chacal, required a different approach. Diego was colder, more calculating. The experience with El Gusano had taught him that rage was an imprecise tool. Now he would use his greatest weapon, his mind. He investigated and discovered that El Chacal supervised a drug spot in an abandoned warehouse. This would not be an alley ambush, but a planned capture. He studied the building's layout, the escape routes, the number of men. The law student was becoming a strategist, applying the logic of legal proceedings to the planning of an urban warfare operation. Vengeance was becoming a science. He captured him alive. The action was swift and efficient, using the element of surprise and his knowledge of the terrain to his advantage. He dragged El Chacal into the depths of the warehouse to a room where the only furniture was a chair and a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. There, Diego conducted his first trial. He did not use physical torture. His cruelty was intellectual. With terrifying calm, he recited every article of the penal code that the Sicario had violated throughout his criminal life. He described in forensic detail what had been done to his sister, forcing the man to confront the brutality of his acts, not as a thug, but as a defendant before an embodied form of the law. After extracting a terrified confession, not only for Sophia's death but for dozens of other crimes, Diego delivered his sentence. The execution was precise, a single shot to the head, but he didn't leave. With steady hands, he took a small copy of the Mexican Constitution he carried, tore out the page containing the fundamental rights to life and justice, and pinned it to the corpse's chest with a knife. It was a message, a declaration. This was not just a murder, it was a symbolic act of war against the system that had failed to protect those very rights. He was rewriting the law with the blood of his enemies. The discovery of the body shocked Mexico City. The crime scene was unlike anything the police had ever seen. The media, sensing a story with legendary potential, dived in headfirst. It was an investigative journalist who, noticing the method and symbolism, nicknamed him El Justiciero de la Facultad, the law school vigilante. The name caught on instantly. He was not just another vigilante. There was an intelligence, a theatrical fury in his acts that captured the public's imagination. The faux story of a possible legal expert dealing out brutal justice was irresistible. In a matter of days, Diego's name, or rather his moniker, was in every newspaper and newscast. The city, long terrified and cynical, reacted in a complex and divided manner. The elite and the authorities condemned him as a barbaric murderer, a threat to order. But in the poor neighborhoods, in the communities where the police only entered to repress, a dangerous seed of admiration began to sprout. El Justiciero became a folk hero, a whispered legend. Small pieces of paper with the names of local criminals began to appear in discreet places like offerings on a profane altar. They were tips, requests, prayers to a new and dark patron saint of vengeance. Diego, unintentionally, had become the vessel for the collective fury of an entire city. The case was assigned to Detective Javier Ramirez. The same officer who had coldly dismissed Diego now found himself hunting the result of that indifference. Ramirez was a good cop in a rotten system, and he immediately recognized what was happening. The crime scene of El Chacal was not the work of a rival gangster. It was personal, it was intelligent, and it was a direct message to him and the entire police force. Although his duty was to arrest the Justiciero, a part of him, the part that was tired of seeing criminals go unpunished, felt a grudging, dark respect. He was hunting a monster, but a monster his own system had helped create. Meanwhile, at the university, Elena Vargas watched her star student fade. Diego still attended classes, but he was an empty shell. His eyes, once bright with idealism, now held a cold, distant depth that chilled her. His contributions in class, once passionate, became cynical and sharp. She tried to talk to him, to offer help, but was met with a wall of indifference. Her mentor's concern gave way to a terrible suspicion. The rise of the Justiciero de la Facultad, a vigilante with an almost academic method, coincided perfectly with the downward spiral of her most promising student. The possibility was so horrific she barely dared to formulate it in her thoughts. Alone in his new hideout, an apartment rented under a false name, Diego looked at himself in the mirror. The image that stared back was that of a stranger. The dark circles, the pallor, the hardened gaze, the face of the young dreamer had been eroded by violence. He was no longer just avenging Sophia. The anonymous tips he received had turned him into an avenging angel, a purge for the city's worst elements. He felt the weight of every life he took, the progressive loss of his own soul. It is in this darkness that a man's humanity is tested. If you feel the weight of his choice, if you understand that the line between hero and monster is so thin, support our channel. Your subscription allows us to continue exploring these shadows of the human soul. Diego's mission expanded. Personal revenge had become a crusade. Using the network of anonymous informants that had formed organically, he began to systematically hunt the members of Los Espectros. His target list now included rapists whose victims were afraid to report them, extortionists who bled small business owners dry, and murderers who had bought their freedom. Each execution was a clear message. The state may have forgotten you, but justice, in its most brutal form, has not. He moved through the city like a ghost, his name echoing like an omen of death in the darkest corners of the underworld. His methods evolved dramatically. The inexperience of the first murder gave way to a lethal efficiency. He learned to use fear as a weapon, to manipulate information, to create discord within the cartel's ranks. He hacked security systems, intercepted communications, and used his legal knowledge to predict the moves of his enemies and the police. The law student was applying the principles of logic and research to guerrilla warfare. He was no longer just a man with a gun. He was an intelligent predator, constantly adapting to survive and to hunt more effectively. The Justiciero's onslaught shook the foundations of Los Espectros. The cartel, accustomed to operating with absolute impunity, suddenly found itself being hunted. Operations were disrupted, trafficking routes became risky, and an internal paranoia began to set in. The enigmatic leader of the cartel, known only as El Silencioso, the Silent One, saw his authority challenged for the first time. From his sanctuary of power, he issued an order. An astronomical bounty was placed on the Justiciero's head. The city turned into a hunting ground, with dozens of sicarios desperate to claim the prize and restore the cartel's honor. The hunt almost ended for Diego in a grain warehouse in the Port District. He was following a lead about an arms shipment when he was lured into an ambush. The confrontation was a blur of gunfire, shattering concrete, and pain. It was 5 against 1. Diego, using the darkness and his agility, managed to turn the tables, but he did not escape unscathed. A bullet grazed his arm, leaving a deep gash, and a knife wound caught him in the leg. He eliminated his attackers in a burst of desperate violence and fled, leaving behind a trail of blood and the certainty that his luck was running out. Detective Ramirez was the first on the scene of the shootout. Amidst the carnage, he found something the Justiciero, wounded and in a hurry, had left behind: a shell casing from a specific, rare caliber, and a fragment of fabric from a jacket brand sold almost exclusively at the university bookstore. The net was closing in. Ramirez felt he was steps away from discovering the vigilante's identity. However, he also faced increasing pressure from his superiors, who strangely seemed more interested in burying the case than solving it, which only deepened his suspicions about the extent of the corruption. With a heavy heart, Elena Vargas decided to confront Diego. She cornered him in an empty university hallway, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and sadness. She didn't accuse him directly. Instead, she spoke of the law, of the soul, of how vengeance was an abyss that consumes whoever stares into it. "This isn't justice, Diego. It's just more darkness," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Diego listened to her in silence, his face an impassive mask. When she finished, he just looked at her with eyes that seemed to have aged decades, and said, "In the darkness, at least I can see." It was a confession and a farewell. The ambush and the conversation with Elena solidified a new resolve in Diego. Hunting the cartel's foot soldiers was like trimming the leaves of a weed. The root would remain alive and strong. To end Los Espectros and give real meaning to his sacrifice, he needed to pull out that root. He made the strategic decision to shift his focus. His war would no longer be a series of reactive battles, but a campaign, focused on a single objective: to find and destroy El Silencioso. This decisive action elevated his journey from a personal vendetta to a direct assault on the heart of the corrupt power that had killed his sister. His new mission required a change in tactics. Violence alone would not be enough. He needed information. On his next hunt, he captured a cartel lieutenant, a man with knowledge of the command structure. The torture that followed was not for sadistic pleasure, but for strategic necessity. Under pressure, the lieutenant revealed a crucial piece of information. El Silencioso was not a traditional drug lord. He was a ghost, a high society businessman who controlled his empire from a distance, completely insulated from the filth of the streets. He was not a gangster. He was a member of the city's untouchable elite. On a rare, quiet night, while cleaning his wounds in his hideout, Diego found an old wallet he had forgotten in a box. Inside was a crumpled photo of him and Sophia, taken on her 15th birthday. They were both smiling, full of a hope that now seemed to belong to another life. For the first time in months, the Justiciero gave way to the brother. The tears he had held back since the morgue finally came, silent and bitter. He cried not for her death, but for his own, for the idealistic young man in the photo whom he had murdered with his own hands, with every life he took in her name. The revelation that El Silenciero was a businessman gave Diego a new trail to follow: the money. He plunged into the digital world, using the intellect he applied to his studies to hack into financial systems and follow the cartel's money laundering trail. He unraveled a complex web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and real estate transactions that connected the dirty drug money to seemingly legitimate businesses, involving the names of politicians and city magnates. The scale of the corruption was larger and deeper than he had ever imagined. The cartel was not a cancer on the city. It was part of its circulatory system. In parallel, Detective Ramirez, disobeying direct orders, continued his own investigation and began to reach the same conclusions. He discovered inexplicable money transfers linking his own department chief to one of the cartel's front companies. Ramirez was at a crossroads. To expose what he knew would mean the end of his career and, possibly, his life. To remain silent would mean being complicit in the system he had sworn to fight. The honest cop and the outlaw vigilante were, unknowingly, hunting the same monster down different dangerous paths. The final piece of Diego's puzzle fell into place when he decrypted an encrypted transaction that mentioned a major event: the annual charity gala for the Helios Foundation, hosted by the celebrated philanthropist and businessman Ricardo Vargas. The foundation's name was a front for the cartel's money laundering operations, and its host, one of the most beloved public figures in the city, could only be El Silencioso himself. He was hiding where no one would ever think to look, under the blinding glare of the spotlight, applauded by the very society he was poisoning. Diego's final preparation did not involve heavy weapons or assault tactics, but rather a perfectly tailored tuxedo and a forged identity. He studied the ballroom layout, the guest list, the security protocols. He would not enter the event as an intruder, but as a guest. This would not be a battle of bullets, but of nerves and ideologies. He was about to walk into the lion's den, not as a wild animal, but as an equal, ready to expose the king of the jungle before his entire court. The stage for the final confrontation was set, and the curtain was about to rise. The Helios Foundation ballroom was a world apart, an aquarium of luxury and power floating above the wounded city. Diego Montoya entered this world not as an avenger, but as a spectre wearing a rented tuxedo. The classical music, the forced laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses created a cacophony that hurt his ears, accustomed to the silence of the hunt. Every smiling face was a mask, every handshake a transaction of power. He moved among the sharks of the Mexican elite, a predator of a different kind, invisible in his contained fury. His eyes, however, were not distracted by the glitter. They scanned the crowd with a single purpose, searching for the face of the man who was the architect of his pain and the king of that masquerade. And then he saw him. In the center of the ballroom, under a spotlight, stood Ricardo Vargas, charismatic, eloquent, the personification of success. He was giving a speech about hope, about the duty of the privileged to help the less fortunate. The audience applauded him fervently. Diego felt his stomach turn. That man, celebrated as a pillar of society, was El Silencioso, the same man whose orders led to the kidnapping and murder of his sister over a neighbor's insignificant drug debt. The hypocrisy was so dense, so suffocating, it almost made him lose control right then and there. To see evil applauded as virtue was the most profound desecration he had ever witnessed. Diego waited for his opportunity with the patience of a spider. He followed Ricardo to a private library, away from the prying eyes of the party. The walls were lined with books he had probably never read. When the door closed, Diego revealed himself. He didn't draw his weapon, he just said the name El Silencioso. For a millisecond, Ricardo's philanthropic mask dropped, revealing the cold emptiness of a predator. There was no fear in his eyes, only an arrogant curiosity, like a king encountering a brazen peasant. "I was wondering when the rabid dog from the university would finally find his master," Ricardo said, his voice calm and venomous. What followed was not a fight, but a duel of philosophies. Ricardo, completely at ease, poured himself a brandy and confessed everything with an amused disdain. He argued that men like him were the true order. The government was weak, the law a fiction. He provided structure, however brutal. "I am the system, kid. You are just a glitch in it," he taunted. He spoke of Sophia's death as regrettable but trivial collateral damage in the grand scheme of his business. He tried to seduce Diego into his cynicism, suggesting that the Justiciero's own quest for control was no different from his, just on a smaller, more sentimental scale. For a terrifying moment, Ricardo's words almost found their mark. Diego looked at his own blood-stained hands and questioned the nature of his crusade. Had he become a monster to hunt another? The darkness of the abyss Ricardo showed him threatened to swallow him whole. But then, like an anchor in a storm, the image of Sophia smiling flooded his mind. The sound of her laughter, the love that had moved him was not the same as Ricardo's lust for power. One was about protecting innocence, the other about exploiting it. "You are not a system," Diego replied, his voice firm for the first time. "You are a plague, and I am the cure." Realizing his psychological warfare had failed, Ricardo smiled and subtly pressed a panic button under his desk. In seconds, 2 bodyguards, posing as event security, entered the library. Violence erupted, shattering the silence and the expensive furniture. Diego, moving with the brutal efficiency forged in alleys and warehouses, took on the 2 men. It was a desperate fight. One of the guards cut him on the shoulder with a knife, but Diego used the pain to fuel his fury, disarming him and using the man's own knife against the second attacker. In less than a minute, the 2 men were down, and Diego, panting and bleeding, was once again alone with Ricardo. The police sirens, a familiar, bittersweet sound, began to wail in the distance, growing closer. Diego had sent an anonymous tip to Javier Ramirez before he entered. Ricardo, his arrogant smile now gone and his face pale, spat, "It's over for you. I'll watch your trial from my penthouse." It was then that Diego revealed his final trump card. He pulled out not just his gun, but a small digital recorder. "The trial has already taken place," he said. In the last few minutes of the struggle, the sensitive microphone had captured Ricardo's entire confession. In a final act of twisted justice, Diego shot the businessman in the leg, incapacitating him. He took the recorder, the proof that would destroy El Silencioso's empire, and killed him with a final, precise shot, sealing his own fate, but ensuring that the truth would, at last, come out. When the library door was breached, it was Detective Javier Ramirez who entered first. He found a scene that would haunt him forever. The bodies of the bodyguards, the magnate Ricardo Vargas executed in his own leather armchair, and in the midst of the chaos, Diego Montoya. He was sitting on the floor, leaning against a bookshelf, bleeding and exhausted, the cold, inert gun beside him. His eyes met Ramirez's, and there was no defiance in them, only a deep emptiness and a silent acceptance. Diego did not resist. He held out his wrists for the handcuffs like a martyr accepting his cross. His war was over. The capture was not a defeat, but the logical, inevitable conclusion to his tragic equation of justice. The recording found in Diego's pocket was the atomic bomb that devastated Mexico City's corrupt elite. Leaked to the press, the posthumous confession of El Silencioso unleashed a scandal of seismic proportions. The names of politicians, police chiefs, and judges were exposed, all complicit in the cartel's web of power. Los Espectros, beheaded and exposed, crumbled within weeks. From the solitude of his cell, Diego watched the news with indifference. He had forced the system to purge itself, to amputate its own gangrenous limbs. He had achieved a cleansing no prosecutor could ever dream of. But the price of this victory was his own soul, a sacrifice he made with open eyes, becoming the fire that consumed the plague, but which also reduced him to ashes. The trial of Diego Montoya paralyzed the country. He became a mirror in which Mexican society saw its deepest fractures reflected. To millions of the disenfranchised, he was an avenging saint. To the establishment, a terrorist. The prosecutor painted him as a cold-blooded monster, while his pro bono defense attorney argued that he was a creation, an inevitable consequence of a failed state. Elena Vargas testified, weeping not for the criminal in the dock, but for the brilliant student she had lost to the darkness. Diego, for his part, remained mute throughout the proceedings, a spectre at his own funeral, for the man he once was had died long ago. The verdict was a surprise to no one. Guilty, all counts, life in prison. As he read the sentence, the judge, in a solemn voice, gave Diego his final official title, engraving it in the annals of the country's criminal history. The most ruthless vigilante in Mexico. The cameras focused on his face, waiting for a reaction, a tear, a flicker of anger or remorse. They found nothing. Diego's face was serene, expressionless. He had avenged Sofia. He had exposed the rot. He had fulfilled his promise. The fact that he would spend the rest of his days in a cage, condemned by the very laws he once loved, was merely the epilogue to a story that had already ended that night in the morgue. The story of Diego Montoya ends here, in a maximum security cell, but the reflection it provokes reverberates. He became a tragic symbol, a terrifying reminder that the line between justice and vengeance is drawn by pain, and that a system that abandons its citizens creates its own monsters to haunt it. He found justice for his sister, but to do so, he had to become the evil he set out to destroy, losing his freedom and his humanity forever. We thank you for reaching the end of this dark journey. If stories like this, which force us to question everything, are important to you, your subscription is what allows us to continue telling them. It ensures that the echo of voices like Diego's is not lost in the silence.